Now let's begin. Roland Scott stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his downtown office, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over the skyline. 20 years. 2 decades of what he believed was a solid marriage, now revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate performance. His reflection in the glass showed a man of 45, trim and composed, with silver threading through his dark hair, a man who looked exactly like what he was. Someone who'd built his architecture firm from the ground up through talent and determination, not the family money everyone assumed he had. His phone buzzed. A message from his attorney, Sean Finn. She filed. Courthouse at 9 tomorrow. Roland pocketed the phone without responding. He'd known this was coming. Had known for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, since the night he'd returned home early from a canceled client dinner and heard Kristen on the phone in her study, laughing in a way she'd never laughed with him. 20 years of this charade, Curtis. But the payout will be worth it. I've earned every penny I'm about to take from him. Curtis Ballard, real estate developer, country club tennis partner, the man whose handshake had always been just a bit too firm, whose smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at Roland. But Roland hadn't confronted them that night. He'd quietly backed away, grabbed his briefcase from the foyer, and left again through the garage. Then he'd driven to his office and sat in the dark, thinking, not about the betrayal. He'd suspected something was off for years, that persistent feeling that Kristen was playing a role rather than living a life with him. No, he'd thought about patterns, about the architecture of deception, about foundations and how to bring them down. The next morning, Roland had hired a private investigator. Not the flashy ex-cop type you saw in movies, but a forensic accountant named Margaret Chun who specialized in untangling financial fraud. I don't need proof of an affair, he'd told her. I need to know everything about my wife's life before she met me, and everything she's done since. Now, 3 months later, Margaret's report sat in a locked drawer in his desk. Not just evidence of infidelity. Not just proof of gold digging. Something much darker. His assistant, Julia, knocked softly before entering. Mr. Scott? I'm heading out. Do you need anything? I'm fine, Julia. See you tomorrow. She hesitated. Sir, if you don't mind me saying, whatever's happening, you've got this. Roland turned from the window and managed a genuine smile. Julia had been with him for 12 years, had watched him build this firm into something that employed 40 people and had projects across 3 states. She knew about the divorce filing. The whole office probably did by now. Thanks, Julia. That means more than you know. After she left, Roland finally opened the drawer and pulled out the files. Not to review them. He'd memorized every word, but to remind himself why he'd spent 3 months playing the oblivious husband instead of throwing Kristen out immediately. Because the affair, the gold digging, the lies, those were just the surface. 15 years ago, something had happened that changed everything, and Kristen thought it was buried. 15 years ago, Roland had been 30, recently married for 5 years, and his firm was just starting to break even. He'd been working late on a design proposal when his business partner and childhood best friend, Oliver Brooks, had called him, voice tight with urgency. Roland, I need you to meet me at the site. The Riverside project. Don't tell anyone. Oliver, it's 11 at night. What's? Please. It's about Kristen. Roland had felt his stomach drop. He'd driven to the half-finished commercial development in a daze, finding Oliver's car parked near the unfinished framework of what would become their firm's breakthrough project. Oliver had been standing by the exposed foundation, holding a folder. I didn't want to believe it, Oliver had said, handing over the documents. But I had to be sure before I told you. The papers showed financial transactions, money being funneled from their business account into an offshore holding company. Small amounts at first, then larger, all authorized by Kristen's signature. She was their administrative manager then, had convinced Roland she wanted to be part of building his dream. She's been doing this for 2 years, Oliver said. I only noticed because I was reconciling accounts for the Riverside bid. Roland, she's stolen almost $200,000. If the auditors find this before we fix it, we're done. Criminal charges, bankruptcy, everything. Roland had stared at the papers, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Why would she? There's more. Oliver pulled out another document. She's been meeting with Curtis Ballard. I've seen them together 3 times in the past month. I think they're planning something. They'd stood there in the darkness, two friends who dreamed of building something together since they were kids sketching buildings in geometry class. Roland's marriage was a lie. His business was being gutted from the inside, and he had no idea how deep the betrayal went. "We can't go to the police," Roland had said finally. "Not yet. If this gets out before we secure the Riverside contract, we lose everything anyway. The scandal alone would kill us. So what do? We document everything. Every transaction, every meeting. And we start moving money back quietly, making it look like accounting errors we're correcting. She can't know we're onto her." Oliver had agreed, but he'd looked worried. "Roland, if she's working with Ballard, they might be planning something worse than theft." His friend's instinct had been right. 2 weeks later, Oliver Brooks was dead, killed when his car went off a bridge during a rainstorm. The police ruled it an accident. Bad weather, slick roads, no witnesses. But Roland knew. He knew from the way Kristen had cried at the funeral with just a bit too much drama. Knew from the way Curtis Ballard had shown up to pay respects wearing an expression of practiced sympathy. And he knew from what he'd found in Oliver's apartment afterward, a note in Oliver's handwriting, dated the day before he died. "Meeting K and C tonight. They don't know I know about Phase 2. If anything happens to me, check the brake lines." Roland had checked. The police report mentioned the investigation into Oliver's car was cursory, rainstorm accident, case closed. But Roland had paid his own mechanic to examine the wreckage before it was crushed. The brake lines had been cut cleanly, then crimped to look like wear and tear. Professional work. He'd spent the next 6 months in a fog of grief and rage, going through the motions of his marriage while rebuilding the business alone. Kristen had been supportive, loving even, playing the devoted wife helping her husband through tragedy. She'd even quit her administrative role, claiming she wanted to give him space to heal and rebuild. What Roland eventually understood was that Oliver's death had been about more than covering up the theft. Oliver had discovered Phase 2, whatever that was, and they'd killed him for it. Present day. Now, Roland closed the files and locked them away again. Tomorrow, Kristen would stand in court and ask for a divorce. She'd probably admit to the affair, might even admit she'd married him for money she thought he had. His family's money. A fiction he'd never bothered to correct because by the time they married, his firm was successful enough that the myth didn't matter. What Kristen didn't know was that Roland had spent 15 years living with a murderer, carefully, methodically building a case that would destroy her completely. Not just divorce her, not just expose the affair, but deliver justice for Oliver Brooks. The evidence in his possession now went far beyond financial records. He had recordings, photographs, digital trails, and, most damning of all, a confession. Not from Kristen, but from the mechanic she and Curtis had hired to tamper with Oliver's car, a man named Vincent Kowalski who developed a conscience and a terminal cancer diagnosis in the same year, and had decided to unburden himself before meeting his maker. Roland's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from his uncle, Frederick Wright, the only family member he'd trusted with the full truth. "Ready for tomorrow?" Roland typed back. "Ready." He took one last look at the city below. Tomorrow, the performance would end. Tomorrow, Kristen would learn that the man she'd underestimated for 20 years had been several steps ahead all along. And tomorrow, she'd finally pay for what she'd done to Oliver. But tonight, Roland went home one last time to the house he'd shared with a killer, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and toasted his old friend. "This one's for you, Oliver. Justice delayed, but never denied." The courthouse steps were crowded with lawyers and clients flowing in and out like a corporate ballet. Roland arrived at 8:30, 30 minutes early, wearing his best charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that felt heavier than it should. Sean Finn met him at the entrance, his attorney's sharp eyes scanning Roland's face for signs of stress. "You look calm," Sean observed. "That's either very good or very concerning." "I've had 3 months to prepare for this moment, Sean. I'm exactly where I need to be." Roland glanced around. "Is she here yet?" "Not yet, but her attorney is." Sean nodded toward a woman in a severe black pantsuit conferring with a clerk. "Diane Morrison. She's good, expensive, and she doesn't take losing well. Whatever Kristen's told her, Morrison believes she's got an airtight case." "She does," Roland said mildly, "for a standard divorce. But this isn't going to be standard." They moved through security and into the marble-floored hallway. Roland had been in this building dozens of times for various professional reasons. Permits, zoning disputes, contract matters. But never for something this personal. Never for something that had been orchestrated across 15 years. Roland. The voice came from behind him, smooth and familiar. He turned to see Curtis Ballard approaching, dressed in an expensive navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. The real estate developer looked every inch the successful businessman, right down to his $1,000 shoes and Rolex. Curtis, I'm surprised to see you here. Just supporting a friend through a difficult time. Curtis's smile was practiced, sympathetic. Kristen asked me to be here for moral support. I hope that's not awkward. Roland met his eyes steadily. Not at all. Though I'm curious how long you've been providing her with support. Something flickered in Curtis's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Kristen and I have been friends for years, as you know. Tennis partners. Charity committee members. Of course. Roland's tone remained pleasant. Friends. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Kristen had arrived, flanked by her attorney and her sister, Merle McGill. At 42, Kristen was still striking, blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, jewelry that caught the light with each movement. She'd maintained the appearance of the perfect society wife flawlessly. Her eyes found Roland's, and for a moment, something unreadable crossed her face. Regret? Triumph? It was gone too quickly to tell. She leaned in to whisper something to Diane Morrison, who nodded and made a note on her legal pad. Mrs. Scott, Sean said formally as they approached. Ms. Morrison. Mr. Finn. Diane Morrison's voice was crisp, professional. Shall we handle this like adults? My client is willing to be generous in the settlement negotiations if your client cooperates. Roland spoke before Sean could respond. Generous? How thoughtful. Though I'm curious what she thinks she's entitled to. Kristen's smile was tight. Half of everything we built together, Roland. That's standard in California community property law, as I'm sure your attorney has explained. Everything we built together, Roland repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. That's an interesting characterization. Your Honor will see you now, a bailiff announced, saving Kristen from responding. The courtroom was smaller than the ones you saw on TV, more functional than dramatic. Judge Patricia Moreno presided, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for brooking no nonsense in her courtroom. Roland had researched her thoroughly. She'd been a family law judge for 20 years, had seen every trick and manipulation in the book, and valued evidence over emotion. They took their seats at opposite tables. Roland felt strangely calm, the way he always did before presenting a major design proposal. This was just another presentation, really. Just another time to show his work. Judge Moreno reviewed the initial filings. Her reading glasses perched on her nose. This appears straightforward. Mrs. Scott is petitioning for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences, seeking equal division of assets and spousal support. Mr. Scott, how does your client respond? Sean stood. Your Honor, my client contests the terms of asset division and spousal support. However, before we proceed, there are some factual matters that need to be established regarding the nature of this marriage. Diane Morrison was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, we're prepared to present evidence of 20 years of marriage, joint property ownership, and... Ms. Morrison, you'll have your turn. Judge Moreno's tone was patient but firm. Mr. Finn, proceed. Thank you, Your Honor. My client would like to make a statement before we hear from Mrs. Scott. The judge looked at Roland. Mr. Scott, you may speak. Roland stood, feeling the weight of 15 years settling on his shoulders. This was the moment. The foundation he'd laid so carefully was about to be tested. Your Honor, I married Kristen Sampson 20 years ago, believing I was marrying someone who loved me. I worked hard to build a life together. I shared everything with her, my dreams, my struggles, my business, my trust. For 15 years, I believed in that marriage completely. He paused, seeing Kristen shift uncomfortably in her seat. Curtis Ballard sat 3 rows back, his expression carefully neutral. But 5 years after our wedding, my business partner, Oliver Brooks, died in what was ruled an accident. After his death, I began to notice inconsistencies. Small things at first. Financial discrepancies. Changed behaviors. Over time, I began to suspect that my marriage was not what it seemed. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Diane Morrison interrupted. If Mr. Scott wishes to make accusations. I'm not making accusations, Roland said calmly. I'm establishing context. Because 3 months ago, I learned something that changed everything. I learned that my wife has been having an affair with Curtis Ballard for approximately 15 years. I learned that she married me under false pretenses. And I learned that she's been planning this divorce for quite some time, believing that she would be entitled to half of assets she thinks came from my family's wealth. Kristen's face had gone pale. Diane Morrison was scribbling notes furiously, clearly thrown by the revelation that Roland knew about the affair. Judge Moreno leaned forward. Mr. Scott, how is this relevant to the divorce proceedings? Because, Your Honor, I can prove that my wife married me fraudulently, with the intent to defraud. I can prove that she and Mr. Ballard conspired to steal from my business. And I can prove that they were involved in the death of Oliver Brooks 15 years ago. The courtroom erupted. Diane Morrison was shouting objections. Kristen had grabbed her attorney's arm, her face a mask of shock and fury. Curtis Ballard had half risen from his seat, his calculated composure finally cracking. Judge Moreno's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order. Everyone sit down and be quiet, or I'll clear this courtroom. She fixed Roland with a hard stare. Mr. Scott, those are extremely serious allegations. I hope you have evidence to support them. Roland opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across to Sean, who approached the bench. Your Honor, I have extensive documentation. Financial records showing systematic theft from my business. Private investigator reports detailing the affair. Communications between Mrs. Scott and Mr. Ballard. And a sworn statement from the mechanic who tampered with Oliver Brooks's vehicle on their orders. Kristen's voice cut through the tension, high and sharp. This is insane. Roland, what are you doing? We can settle this like adults. You don't need to. Tell the truth. Roland turned to look at her fully for the first time. That's what I'm doing, Kristen. Finally telling the truth. No more performing. No more pretending. Her eyes were wide, desperate. I don't know what lies someone told you, but... Vincent Kowalski, Roland said quietly. The mechanic from Precision Auto Service. He's very sick, Kristen. Terminal cancer. And he decided he didn't want to die with Oliver's blood on his conscience. He told me everything. How Curtis came to him with a job. How you provided the schedule, when Oliver would be driving, where he'd be going. How they paid him $20,000 to make it look like an accident. The color drained from Kristen's face completely. Curtis Ballard looked like he was considering bolting from the courtroom. Judge Moreno held up a hand for silence. This is beyond the scope of a divorce hearing. If Mr. Scott has evidence of criminal activity, this needs to be turned over to law enforcement immediately. Already done, Your Honor, Sean said. The DA's office has had copies of everything for the past week. They're preparing charges as we speak. Your Honor. Diane Morrison's voice was desperate now. I request an immediate recess. I need to consult with my client. Where did you get these? Kristen's voice broke through, raw and panicked. She was staring at Roland like she'd never seen him before. That was supposed to be buried. How did you a 15-year-old secret? Secrets don't stay buried forever, Roland said. Not when someone's willing to dig long enough, deep enough, patiently enough. You thought I was weak, Kristen. You thought I was too trusting, too focused on my work to notice what was happening under my own roof. You underestimated me. This is entrapment. Curtis Ballard shouted from his seat. Your Honor, he's been planning this. Mr. Ballard, you are not party to these proceedings. Sit down and be quiet, or you'll be removed. Judge Moreno's voice was ice. She looked at the documents Sean had provided, flipping through pages with increasing gravity. Mr. Scott, I'm inclined to believe there's merit to these claims. Ms. Morrison, I'm granting you a 1-hour recess to consult with your client. When we reconvene, I expect a full accounting of these allegations. As the judge's gavel fell, Kristen lunged across the space between the tables, grabbing Roland's arm. Please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. Please, Roland. We can work something out. I'll drop the divorce. We can go back to what? Roland pulled his arm free, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. To pretending? To living a lie? To dishonoring Oliver's memory every day? No, Kristen. This ends today. One way or another, this ends. Sean guided him toward the exit as bailiffs moved to separate them. Roland could hear Kristen sobbing, could hear Diane Morrison's urgent, low-voiced conference with her client, could hear Curtis Ballard arguing with someone on his phone, already calling his own attorney. In the hallway, Frederick Wright was waiting, his uncle's weathered face creased with concern and pride. "You did it, son. You actually did it." "Not yet," Roland said. "This is just the opening move." "The DA's really filing charges?" "Tomorrow morning. Murder charges for Oliver. Conspiracy to commit fraud. They've been building their case alongside mine for the past month." Roland leaned against the wall, feeling the adrenaline finally starting to fade. "Sean, what happens now?" His attorney was already on his phone, but he paused long enough to answer. "Now? Now they panic. Morrison will advise Kristen to withdraw the divorce petition and avoid making any more statements. Curtis will lawyer up hard, but with Kowalski's testimony and the evidence you've gathered." Sean smiled grimly. "They're done. Both of them." Through the courtroom doors, Roland could still hear raised voices, Kristen's, her sister Merle's, Diane Morrison's, all arguing, all trying to figure out how their sure thing had turned into a nightmare. Roland thought about Oliver, about the friend who'd tried to warn him, who'd paid with his life for discovering the truth. For 15 years, Roland had carried the weight of that knowledge, had played the oblivious husband while building his case brick by brick, just like he built his buildings, with patience, precision, and unshakable foundations. "Mr. Scott," a young woman approached hesitantly, a district attorney's badge clipped to her belt. "I'm Assistant DA Jennifer Reyes. I wanted to introduce myself before tomorrow's proceedings." Roland shook her hand. "Thank you for taking this seriously, Ms. Reyes. I know it's not a typical case." "Typical? No." Her smile was sharp. "But it's solid. Your documentation is meticulous, almost obsessive." "I'm an architect," Roland said simply. "I don't build anything that isn't meant to last." When the recess ended and they filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Kristen sat hunched over, her perfect composure shattered. Her sister Merle gripped her hand, shooting venomous looks at Roland. Curtis Ballard was conspicuously absent, likely already consulting with his legal team. Diane Morrison stood before the judge with visible reluctance. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented and the potential criminal implications, my client wishes to withdraw her petition for divorce at this time." "Denied," Judge Moreno said flatly. "Mr. Scott, do you wish to proceed with the divorce?" Roland stood. "I do, Your Honor. But I'm filing a counterpetition. I'm seeking divorce on grounds of fraud and seeking full ownership of all marital assets based on Mrs. Scott's deception and theft. I'm also requesting that any claims she might make to my business or properties be dismissed with prejudice." "Your Honor, you can't simply," Diane Morrison started. "I can do whatever the evidence supports, Counselor. And from what I've seen here today, Mr. Scott has provided substantial documentation of fraud, infidelity, and conspiracy." Judge Moreno looked at Kristen directly. "Mrs. Scott, do you understand that based on these allegations, you may be facing criminal charges?" Kristen's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then I'm ordering a temporary freeze on all marital assets pending investigation. Neither party may dispose of, sell, or transfer any property or funds until this matter is resolved. Additionally, I'm ordering Mrs. Scott to surrender her passport." The judge made a note. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks, at which time I expect the district attorney's office to provide an update on their investigation. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. As they filed out, Kristen caught Roland's arm one more time, her grip desperate. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice hollow. "About Oliver?" Roland looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years without the filter of polite pretense. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough to make sure you'd pay for it." "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered. "It was Curtis's idea. He said Oliver was going to ruin everything, that we needed to." "Save it for your lawyer," Roland said, pulling free. "Or better yet, save it for the jury." He walked away without looking back, leaving her standing in the courthouse hallway, the ruins of her careful plans scattered around her like broken glass. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Roland stood on the courthouse steps, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years. Sean was already fielding calls from reporters who'd gotten wind of the story. Frederick Wright stood beside him, a solid, reassuring presence. "Oliver would be proud," his uncle said quietly. Roland nodded, feeling the weight of grief and satisfaction mixing in his chest. "I hope so. I really hope so." His phone buzzed, a message from Julia at the office. Saw the news. The team is behind you 100%. We're ready to weather whatever comes. That was something else Kristen had miscalculated. She'd thought his business was just about money, about profit and loss. She hadn't understood that Roland had built something real, something that mattered to people. His employees weren't just workers. They were a team, a family of sorts. They'd stood by him through Oliver's death, through the hard years of rebuilding. They'd stand by him through this too. What now? Frederick asked. Roland smiled, feeling something like peace beginning to settle over him. Now I go back to work. I have buildings to design, a business to run, and a life to rebuild. The real one this time. And Kristen, Curtis, they'll get what they deserve. The law will handle them now. Roland started down the steps toward where Sean was waving him over for a statement to the press. I spent 15 years being patient, Uncle Fred. I can wait a little longer for justice. But as he faced the cameras and the questions, as he gave his carefully prepared statement about fraud and betrayal and the pursuit of truth, Roland allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The performance was over. The masks had been removed. And for the first time in 20 years, he was exactly who he was supposed to be. Not a mark, not a victim, but a man who'd fought back and won. The real work was just beginning, but the foundation, as always with Roland's work, was solid. The following weeks blurred into a cascade of legal proceedings, media attention, and revelation. Roland had anticipated the scrutiny, had prepared for it the same way he prepared for everything. Methodically, thoroughly, with contingency plans for every variable. What he hadn't fully prepared for was how it would feel to watch Kristen's carefully constructed world crumble. It started with the forensic accountants. Margaret Shun, the woman Roland had hired 3 months ago, presented her findings to both the divorce court and the district attorney's office. She'd traced every stolen dollar, every fraudulent transfer, every shell company Kristen and Curtis had created to siphon funds from Scott Architecture over the years. It's actually quite brilliant in its way, Margaret explained to Roland in his office one evening, spreadsheets projected on the conference room wall. They started small, a few thousand here, a few thousand there. Amounts small enough that they'd look like accounting discrepancies or miscategorized expenses. But over 15 years, she highlighted a column of numbers. They stole just over $2 million. Roland stared at the figure, feeling a cold fury settle in his chest. $2 million. Money that could have gone to employee bonuses, to expansion, to the scholarship fund he'd wanted to start in Oliver's name. And they covered their tracks? They thought they did. But they made one critical error. They assumed you'd never look. They assumed you trusted Kristen completely, that you'd never question her access to the accounts. Margaret pulled up another screen. What they didn't anticipate was that I'm very good at finding money that doesn't want to be found. The trail led exactly where Roland suspected, to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, to a vacation property in Costa Rica purchased under Curtis Ballard's name, to luxury cars and jewelry and a lifestyle that neither Kristen nor Curtis could have afforded on their legitimate incomes alone. The DA loves this, Sean Finn reported after meeting with Jennifer Reyes and her team. They're calling it one of the most well-documented cases of conspiracy to commit fraud they've seen. Add in the evidence about Oliver, and he shook his head. Roland, they're talking about 15 to 20 years, minimum. Roland absorbed this information in silence. 20 years. The same length as his marriage. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost poetic. But the fraud charges were just the opening act. The real devastation came when Vincent Kowalski took the stand. The mechanic was a shell of a man, his body ravaged by the cancer that would claim him within months. But his mind was sharp, and his testimony was devastating. In a preliminary hearing held to determine if there was sufficient evidence to proceed with murder charges, Kowalski described in detail how Curtis Ballard had approached him with a job. He said there was a man who was causing problems for his business partner. Kowalski testified, his voice raspy but clear. He needed the man's car to have an accident. Made it sound like corporate espionage or something. Told me there'd be $20,000 cash if I could make it look like a mechanical failure. And did you accept? Jennifer Reyes asked. Yeah. Kowalski's shame was palpable. I was in debt. My daughter needed medical treatments. I told myself it was just a car, just some corporate guy who'd probably survive anyway. I didn't think. He paused, swallowing hard. I didn't think about the rain that night. Didn't think about how fast he might be driving. Didn't think I was actually killing someone. Mr. Kowalski, did you work alone on this job? No. The woman, Mrs. Scott, she came to the shop the day before. Told me exactly when the car would be there, what time I'd have access. She knew Oliver Brooks's schedule perfectly. She even knew which parking spot he used. Kowalski looked directly at Kristen, who sat stone-faced beside her attorney. She looked me in the eye and said, "Make sure it can't be traced back. Make sure it looks completely natural." Those were her exact words. Roland watched Kristen's reaction from his seat in the gallery. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't show any emotion at all. It was like watching a mannequin, beautiful and hollow. Curtis Ballard's attorney tried to discredit Kowalski, dying man seeking redemption, no physical evidence linking his clients to the crime, just the word of a convicted felon. Kowalski had a record for minor theft from 20 years ago. But Roland had anticipated this too. "Your Honor," Jennifer Reyes said, "the people would like to present additional evidence." What followed was a masterclass in long-term evidence gathering. Roland had provided the DA's office with phone records showing multiple calls between Kristen's cell phone and Curtis's office phone in the week before Oliver's death. Security footage from a restaurant showing Kristen and Curtis meeting 3 days before the accident, their body language intense and conspiratorial. Bank records showing a cash withdrawal of $20,000 from one of Curtis's business accounts 2 days after Oliver's death. But the piece de resistance, the evidence that made even Kristen's poker face crack, was the recording. "We found this on a backup drive from Oliver Brooks's personal computer," Jennifer Reyes explained. Mr. Brooks was apparently recording his phone conversations in the weeks before his death, possibly because he suspected something was wrong. The recording crackled to life in the courtroom, and Roland heard his dead friend's voice for the first time in 15 years. "Kristen, I know what you're doing. I've seen the transfers. I've tracked the money." Oliver sounded calm, professional, like he was handling a business negotiation rather than confronting a thief. Kristen's voice came through clearly. "Oliver, you're making a mistake. If you go to Roland with this, you'll destroy him. Do you want to do that to your best friend? What I want is for you to stop stealing from us. Put the money back, leave Roland, and we'll forget this ever happened." A pause. Then Kristen's voice, colder now. "And if I don't? Then I go to the authorities. I have copies of everything, Kristen. You and whoever you're working with won't get away with this. You're threatening me? I'm giving you a choice. Make the right one." The recording ended. In the silence that followed, Roland could hear Kristen's breathing, rapid and shallow. Her attorney, Diane Morrison, looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Judge Moreno ordered the case to proceed to trial. Bail was set at $5 million, an amount neither Kristen nor Curtis could make since their assets were frozen. They'd await trial in custody. As the bailiffs led Kristen away, she looked at Roland one final time. "I loved you," she said, the words desperate and hollow. "Maybe not at first, but over the years, Don't," Roland said quietly. "Don't insult both of us with lies. Not now." She opened her mouth to say something else, but the bailiff was already moving her toward the exit. Curtis Ballard followed in his own set of restraints, his expensive suit looking incongruous with the handcuffs. The trial took 3 months to begin and 2 weeks to conclude. Roland attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the gallery, watching as the prosecution methodically dismantled the defense's arguments. He watched Kristen's sister Merle take the stand, defending her sibling with increasing desperation. Watched Curtis Ballard's attorney try to shift all blame to Kristen, painting her as the manipulative mastermind and Curtis as merely a foolish man led astray by love. Neither strategy worked. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Murder in the second degree for both Kristen and Curtis in Oliver Brooks's death. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Grand theft. The list went on. Sentencing came a month later. Kristen received 25 years to life. Curtis got 20 years. Both looked smaller somehow in their prison jumpsuits, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. Before sentencing was finalized, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Roland had prepared his carefully, had written and rewritten it dozens of times. When his turn came, he stood before the court and spoke not about himself, but about Oliver. "Oliver Brooks was my best friend since we were 12 years old," Roland said. his voice steady and clear. We built sandcastles on the beach and talked about building real buildings someday. We studied architecture together, started our firm together, dreamed together. He was the best man at my wedding. He was going to be the godfather to the children Kristen and I never had. He paused, looking at Kristen. She was staring at the floor. When Oliver died, a part of me died with him. But I didn't know then what I know now, that his death wasn't an accident. That the two people responsible were sitting at my dinner table, sleeping in my bed, playing tennis at my club. That I'd been living with his killers for 15 years. Roland's hands tightened on the podium. Your Honor, I don't believe in revenge for revenge's sake. But I believe in justice. I believe that Oliver Brooks deserved to live, to build, to create, to love. He was robbed of that by two people who valued money more than human life. And I believe they should spend the rest of their lives paying for that choice. When he sat down, he felt Frederick Wright's hand on his shoulder, solid and supportive. Felt Sean's quiet presence on his other side. And felt, for the first time since Oliver's funeral, something like closure beginning to form. The judge agreed. Maximum sentences for both defendants. They'd be eligible for parole in 20 years, but given the severity of the crime and the complete lack of remorse either had shown, parole seemed unlikely. As the bailiffs led them away for the final time, Curtis Ballard looked at Roland with something that might have been respect. You played a long game, he said. Longer than I would have thought you capable of. Roland didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. 6 months after the trial ended, Roland stood in the lobby of the newly completed Brooks Memorial Innovation Center, a state-of-the-art facility for young architects and designers that he designed and funded entirely on his own. The building was his finest work, all sweeping lines and natural light, form and function balanced perfectly. A plaque near the entrance read, "In memory of Oliver Brooks, who believed that buildings should inspire and that friends should be loyal." This center stands as a testament to both. Julia found him there, standing alone in the afternoon light. "Mr. Scott? The ribbon cutting is about to start. Everyone's waiting." Roland nodded, but didn't move immediately. He was thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Kristen before she'd been transferred to the state prison. She'd asked for one final meeting, and against Sean's advice, Roland had agreed. "Why?" she'd asked him through the plexiglass partition. "Why did you wait so long? Why didn't you confront me when you first knew about the affair? Why didn't you turn me in when you found out about Oliver?" Roland had considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I needed to be sure. Because I needed evidence that would stand up in court, not just suspicions. And because..." He'd paused, choosing his words. "Because I needed you to believe you'd won. I needed you to feel safe enough to get sloppy. And you did. You used me." "No," Roland had corrected gently. "You used me. I just stopped letting you." She'd laughed then, a broken sound. 20 years. We could have had a real marriage, Roland. If I'd just been honest from the start. If I'd given us a real chance. "We'll never know," he'd said. "Because you made your choices, and I made mine. And now we both have to live with the consequences." That had been their last conversation. Roland hadn't visited again, hadn't written, hadn't acknowledged the letters she sent periodically from prison, letters that started as angry accusations and gradually morphed into something that might have been regret, though Roland suspected it was more regret at being caught than at the crimes themselves. "Mr. Scott." Julia's voice pulled him back to the present. "Right. The ribbon cutting." Roland smiled and followed her outside, where a crowd had gathered. Clients, employees, city officials, journalists. And in the front row, Oliver Brooks's parents, now elderly but still standing straight, their eyes bright with tears as they looked at the building that would honor their son's memory. Roland gave his speech, talking about innovation and creativity and the importance of nurturing young talent. He cut the ribbon alongside the Brooks family. He fielded questions from the press about how it felt to see justice served, about how he'd maintained his business through the scandal, about his plans for the future. What he didn't tell them was that the Brooks Memorial Innovation Center was just the first step. The $2 million that Kristen and Curtis had stolen had been recovered, and then some. Their seized assets had been liquidated, and after legal fees and restitution, there was enough left over to fund scholarships, grants, and facilities for aspiring architects for years to come. Roland had turned their greed into something that would help hundreds of young people achieve their dreams. It felt like a fitting final chapter. That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the building stood quiet and proud in the twilight, Roland returned one more time. He stood in the main hall, looking up at the soaring ceiling, the interplay of glass and steel and light. "We did it, Oliver," he said softly to the empty space. "Not the way we planned, but we did it anyway. The firm's stronger than ever. And you're going to live on in every person who learns and creates in this building. Every design they dream up. Every structure they build. You're part of that now. Forever." He thought about Kristen, in her cell, and Curtis in his. He thought about the 15 years he'd spent building his case, brick by brick, carefully and patiently. He thought about the marriage that had never been real, the betrayal that had cut deeper than any wound, the friend whose death had needed avenging. And then he thought about tomorrow, about the new project he was starting, a community center in an underserved neighborhood, about the young architect he'd just hired, a brilliant woman fresh out of school who reminded him a little of himself at that age, full of dreams and determination, about the life he was building now, based on truth instead of lies, on genuine relationships instead of performance. Roland Scott walked out of the Brooks Memorial Innovation Center as the last light faded from the sky. Behind him, the building stood as testament to patience, justice, and the long game. Ahead of him stretched a future he'd earned, free from the weight of secrets and pretense. He'd spent 20 years married to a lie and 15 years pursuing the truth. Now, finally, he could just live. And that, Roland thought as he got into his car and drove toward home. A new home, a smaller place but entirely his own, was the best revenge of all. Not the trial or the conviction or the prison sentences, but this, the freedom to build something real. The foundation, as always, was solid. Everything else would follow. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.